Namaste, and good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritam Jagarbhavasa Deha Pashamidrisham Yapitam Swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam Swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishna Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. We salute Sri Ramakrishna, the God of gods and Lord of existence, who of his own free will took on human birth and lived a luminous life of divine play for the destruction of human ills. We salute that incarnation of God, Paramahamsa Ramakrishna, who was worshipped by pure-hearted disciples like Swami Vivekananda, and who is ceaselessly served by Sri Sarada Devi, the Divine Mother herself. Om Tavakatamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Janaha. O Lord, your nectar-like words are praised by the wise and are full of auspiciousness. They destroy the curse of evil, bring good to those who hear them, and bring new life to those who are scorched by the ills of worldly existence. Magnanimous are they who spread your message. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning we will continue with our study and reading of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, where we left off last time. We are on what in the English version is chapter 13, The Master and M, August 19th, 1883, and in the lower portion of page 275. So this again was August 19th. That means it was in the midst of the rainy season in Bengal. And this was a Sunday when devotees had off from work and were free to come to Sri Ramakrishna. And so a number of devotees had gathered, and at this point in the conversation, it was after 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So M continues his narration. In the meantime, in the course of conversation, other devotees had arrived. Someone referred to the political revolution and civil war in Kabul. A devotee said that Yaqub Khan, the Amir of Afghanistan, had been deposed. He told the master that the Amir was a great devotee of God. Master, but you must remember that pleasure and pain are the characteristics of the embodied state. In Kavi Kankan's Chandi, it is written that Kaluvir was sent to prison and a heavy stone placed on his chest. Yet Kalu was born as a result of a boon from the Divine Mother of the universe. Thus, pleasure and pain are inevitable when a soul accepts a body. Again, take the case of Srimanta, who was a great devotee. Though his mother, Kullana, was very much devoted to the Divine Mother, there was no end to his troubles. He was almost beheaded. There is also the instance of the woodcutter, who was a great lover of the Divine Mother. She appeared before him and showed him much grace and love, but he had to continue his profession of woodcutting and earn his livelihood by that arduous work. Again, while Devaki, Krishna's own mother, was in prison, she had a vision of God himself, endowed with 4 hands, holding the mace, discus, conch shell, and lotus. But with all that, she couldn't get out of prison. So here, someone among the devotees refers to the revolution in Afghanistan. And as we know, the political troubles in Afghanistan have been going on for a long time. Not even just with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There were troubles before that. And the British tried to conquer Afghanistan. And so there have been no end to the troubles of Afghanistan. But the devotee mentions that Yaqub Khan, who was the Amir of Afghanistan at that time, was a great devotee of God. And yet he was deposed. And so the Sri Ramakrishna understood the idea behind the devotees bringing that up, that Yaqub Khan was a great devotee of God, a Muslim, a great devotee, and a great devotee of God, a great devotee of Allah. But the but comes here, but he was deposed. And so Sri Ramakrishna understood that why would it be that a great devotee of God would have to suffer as the Amir Khan was suffering? He was devoted to God. Wouldn't God protect him from suffering? And so Sri Ramakrishna gives example after example to show that quite the contrary. Not that God punishes his devotees, but the idea is when we take on an embodied state, when we enter into a body, when we identify with a body, even great devotees sometimes have to suffer a great deal. And so he mentions Kavi Kankan's Chandi. It's written that Kaluvir was sent to prison and a heavy stone was placed on his chest. Even though he was born as the result of a boon from the Divine Mother. That is, the Divine Mother granted the boon that this child would be born. And yet he had to suffer so much. He had to spend time in prison and torture in prison. And so he says, pleasure and pain are inevitable when one accepts a body. So we can't expect to have a life free of suffering once we've accepted a body. Yes, sometimes we see people who go through life with not much trouble. They seem to sort of float through life and escape the great tragedies and sorrows that come to others. They don't escape suffering. Nobody escapes suffering. But there are people, yes, who seem to get along fairly easily through life. But oftentimes such people, unless they are spiritually inclined, often such people float through life and never get any depth in life also. That's why Swami Vivekananda said that show me what a man has suffered and I shall show you the quality of the man. That is, that through suffering great qualities are developed. And so people who get through life very easily, they often don't have much substance to them. Because they haven't been challenged and they haven't had to develop the substance in order to face the challenge. It's also true, of course, that people who have no spiritual perspective, they're destroyed by the difficulties of life. If they have too many difficulties in life, they lose their mind, they lose their wits, they become bitter, whatever. But for a person who has a spiritual perspective, then that suffering brings depth of understanding. And so thus pleasure and pain are inevitable when a soul accepts a body. And he says, he gives the case of Sri Manta, the great devotee. And his mother was a great a devotee of the Divine Mother. And yet there was no end to his troubles. He was almost beheaded, as Sri Ramakrishna mentioned. And so that's the case of great devotees, that such things have happened. There's also the instance of the woodcutter, who was a great lover of the Divine Mother. And yet, in spite of his devotion, he continued to be very poor and had to eke out a living by woodcutting. Again, as we all know, that was not a time when somebody could go out and buy a wood splitter, a gas-powered wood splitter, and a chainsaw, and sell a bundle of wood for $20. This was a time when everybody used wood for cooking and for fuel, and most people were poor. And so you got very little money for a lot of work in cutting wood, which all had to be done with hand tools. And so this great devotee of God barely eked out a living through arduous labor. And he mentions Devaki, who had the vision of Vishnu with 4 arms, who was to be born as her son, as Krishna. She had the vision of Vishnu in prison, but she still remained in prison. So again, the point of it is, what should be our surprise that the Amir of Afghanistan is a great devotee of God? Yes, granted that he is. But that doesn't mean that he escapes all suffering. So M says, why speak only of getting out of prison? Again, the last thing Sri Ramakrishna said was the example of Devaki, who had the vision of Vishnu and yet remained in prison. Why speak only of getting out of prison? This body is the source of all our troubles. Devaki should have been freed from the body. So what to speak of freed from prison? She should have been freed from the greater prison of embodiment. And so to that, the Master says, the truth is that one must reap the result of prarabdha karma. The body remains as long as the results of past actions do not completely wear away. Once a blind man bathed in the Ganges, and as a result was freed of his sins, but his blindness remained all the same. It was because of his evil deeds in his past birth that he had to undergo such affliction. So here Sri Ramakrishna brings up the idea of prarabdha, that is, that karma which brought this body into birth. So as most of you know, there are there is a classification of our karma, our accumulated actions. And the example is given of a quiver of arrows for an archer. So the archer has taken one arrow and has set it in motion. The arrow is already going towards its target. That is prarabdha. And I'll explain the analogy further in a moment. That's prarabdha. He's taken another arrow in hand. That's agami karma. And then he has the quiver full of arrows that are waiting to be used, and that's sanchita karma. And so sanchita karma means the karma of past lives which are not yet in motion, which are not yet taking effect. They're there, they're going to take effect in the future or at some time in the future, but they're there waiting. And so all of us have many collected karmas from past acts in this life or in previous lives, which are just sitting there, not yet active. And then there are karmas which we have in hand, ready to put on the bow and to shoot. We've already taken it out of the quiver. The karma which we are ready to put into motion, we have a choice of putting it back in the quiver. We're going to shoot at a target, and we see that the target is not what we thought it was. It's a human being. Say we were, the example given is of hunting. So we're deer hunting. Not that I go deer hunting, I never have been, but say, for the example, deer hunting, and I see what I think is a deer in the woods, and I'm ready to shoot. And then suddenly I see that no, that's not a deer. Perhaps it's a human being, perhaps it's a dog or something I don't want to shoot. And so I put the arrow back in the quiver so that I still have control over. It's an action I'm about to do, inspired by past actions, but I still have the choice of stopping it. But the action, the arrow which is already shot, there's no way that I can stop it. And so that is prarabdha karma. The karmas of the past, when we die, the karmas of our past are organized, they're ordered. In fact, many of you know, maybe all of you know of the common belief, and it's seen in the lives of some people who have near-death experiences, that just before death, one's life passes before one. In fact, they're recorded, scientifically studied records of people with near-death experiences where many said that when they faced clinical death, at the moment of clinical death, their whole life passed in front of them. And yet, in just a moment, the whole of their life, and yet incidents which they had thought were unimportant, suddenly they saw had been very important. And other instances which they thought were very important, they saw that no, that wasn't really important. And so at that moment, our karmas are being organized according to their importance, and it's that which leads to our next birth. And so when we are born now, we are born because of that reorganization of karma according to what is important for our next birth. And so that karma is going to be fulfilled. We go forward with that karma, and until that karma exhausts itself, we remain alive. That's one of the reasons why in the Hindu tradition, suicide is considered something that is has a terrible effect on our karma. If we succeed in suicide, then we're cutting off that opportunity to exhaust our prarabdha karma. That which brought us into this life, we're cutting it short. And as Sri Ramakrishna says, we have to come back again and again in order to pay for that, that karma which had to be experienced. And so the prarabdha karma is going to continue until the body drops, even for a realized soul, a person who is liberated. They're liberated from karma. And from their standpoint, they are even liberated from prarabdha karma because they no longer have a sense of agency. They're identified with God. But from our standpoint, we see that their body continues even after their enlightenment, and they continue. Their body continues. Body and mind continue through experiences until the body drops in death, and so that is when their prarabdha karma has ended. So in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali says that when we are born, our prarabdha karma has determined how long we will live and how much pleasurable experiences and painful experiences we will have. Those things are the parameters of our present birth. Those are decided at the time of our birth. And so death is considered not to be an accident. It comes when our prarabdha is exhausted for this life. Even if we die in an accident, it's considered that also is that accidental end has come brought about by our karma. So prarabdha has to be experienced. That's the idea. So that's what Sri Ramakrishna is referring to here, that when he says, the body remains as long as the results of past actions do not completely wear away. So not all of your past actions, but the prarabdha karma, that which brought this body into existence, and that karma which this body is meant to fulfill and to exhaust and to learn from. So yes, sir, the arrow has already left the bow. The arrow that has already left the bow is beyond our control. So here M refers to that example, a traditional example which I gave, the quiver of arrows. the arrow that you have in hand, which you're ready to shoot, that you still have control over. And the ones in the quiver, you have control over them too. You can decide not to take them out. But the arrow that's already shot, has already left the bow and is beyond our control. Master, however much a bhakta may experience physical joy and sorrow, he always has knowledge and the treasure of divine love. This treasure never leaves him. Take the Pandava brothers, for instance. Though they suffered so many calamities, they did not lose their God consciousness even once. Where can you find men like them, endowed with so much knowledge and devotion? So that's a beautiful resolution to this, the idea that, yes, even great devotees sometimes have to suffer terribly. Let me say, because this is oftentimes misunderstood, this doesn't mean that great devotees have to suffer. No. There are many great devotees, great saintly people who lead a quiet life, a quiet life of blissful consciousness of God. That is, you could even say that that is the norm for those who have become saintly. But there are many, many examples, which he just gave several of, where great devotees and great jnanis also have had to suffer terribly in life. But he's saying here that however much a bhakta, a devotee, may experience physical joy and sorrow, he always has the knowledge and treasure of divine love. So even in the midst of that suffering, Devaki, Srimanta, Kaluvir, and others, they had that devotion which sustained them. That devotion which, in spite of the outward suffering, that was a source of unending joy and fulfillment to them. And so if we get that, it doesn't matter whether we suffer or have an easy life. Either way, it doesn't matter, because we have the treasure which is beyond all reckoning. And so that is the solution to life's problems. The solution to life's problems can't be bought with money. It can't be bought with ease and comfort. It's bought by the attainment of devotion and knowledge. And if we have that, whatever we have to face in life, we find that that sustains us, no matter how difficult it is. And he gives the example of the Pandavas. In the West, Swami Vivekananda also mentions the Pandavas. In a lecture or two, he mentions that how much they had to suffer, and yet they maintained their devotion and the knowledge of God. So no matter how much they suffered so many calamities, but they did not lose their God consciousness even once. So then the narration continues, M continues. Just then, in this moment of the conversation, Narendra and Colonel Vishwanath Upadhyaya entered the room. Narendra was then 22 years old and studying in college. They saluted the master and sat down. The master requested Narendra to sing. The tanpura hung on the west wall of the room. The devotees fixed their eyes on Narendra as he began to tune the drums. So Colonel Vishwanath Upadhyaya, he was an officer of the government of Nepal and a great devotee. Sri Ramakrishna often mentions him as a great devotee. And of course, we know Narendra, the future Vivekananda. Master to Narendra, the drums don't sound as well as before. Captain, they are now full, therefore they are quiet, like a vessel filled with water. Or they are like a holy man who remains silent when his heart is full of God consciousness. That's a rather strange analogy, because that's good for a person, but you don't want the drums to be silent. So there's, with a person, if they're silent because they're full of God consciousness, that's a good thing. Drums, if they are silent or not sounding good, then there's something wrong. That's not a good thing. But then Master, taking the cue from Captain, whom Sri Ramakrishna loved, the Captain Upadhyay, Vishwanath Upadhyay very much. So he says, but what about sages like Narada? Captain, they talked because they were moved by the sufferings of others. Master, you are right. After attaining samadhi, Narada, Shukadeva, and others came down a few steps, as it were, to the plane of normal consciousness and broke their silence out of compassion for the sufferings of others and to help them. So again, the captain, in relation to the drums, said that they are like one who has attained to God consciousness and becomes silent. And so then the master saying, yes, but what about sages like Narada? Narada is one of the Chiranjivas, that is a jiva like one of us, a human being, not a deity, but a human being who attained to the realization of the divine, but who continues in human embodiment, not necessarily in a physical body, but in a subtle body. He doesn't have a normal death, and even after the attainment of enlightenment and divine devotion, he continues in personal form and travels throughout the universe, helping others on the path of spiritual life. So like Hanuman also is a Chiranjeev. It's said that Hanuman still continues in a personal form. And so there are a few of those who are said to have attained to full enlightenment, but who continue to remain in personal form in order to help others. Swami Brahmananda, Rakhal Maharaj, when he was in Vrindavan, he practicing austerities at one point after Sri Ramakrishna had passed away. He was practicing austerities, and every night at midnight, someone would come and wake him up, and he would see this sage who lived in his subtle body in Vrindavan and would wake Swami Brahmananda up so that he would meditate. The sage would sit there and indicate with his beads, his mala, that now it's time to do japa. So Swami Brahmananda would get up. Rather than sleeping, he would get up and start doing his japa. So Swami Brahmananda said that there are great souls who remain in personal form in order to help other sadhakas. So this sage, who knows who he had been, but some illumined sage, had remained and gave aid to those other spiritual aspirants who were elevated enough to receive that aid and to benefit from that aid. So Narada, just one other thing about Narada, he's Swami Bhashyananda, when I had joined, long after I joined in Ganges, or 3 years or so, 2-3 years after I joined, there was someone who came to join the monastery, and Swami Bhashyanandaji gave him the name Narada because he played the guitar and sang and composed his own songs and so forth. So because Narada was a musician and always singing and dancing, he named this brahmachari Narada. So a devotee who's now a Swami of the order, of Indian birth, but who was studying in North America. He used to come to visit us in the summertime during his break from college. And he's now the head of the Lucknow Center, but he used to come and join us in fruit picking season in Ganges. So he asked us about this new monk, and we said, oh, his name is Narada, and he started laughing. And he said, oh, they couldn't be Narada. And we said, no, that's the name Swami Bhashyanandaji gave him. And he laughed again, and he said, it must be a joke. And so we didn't understand. Of course, we had read about Narada in the Srimad Bhagavatam, but didn't know the history of Narada. So Narada, in the legends of India and in the Puranas and so forth, Narada is a divine troublemaker. He's always going around causing misunderstandings between people, causing fights among people, all types of misunderstandings, quarrels and other things. Intentionally, he goes and stirs up trouble. But that trouble always, in the end, in the meantime, it may create a lot of trouble, serious trouble, but in the end, it always leads to a good result. And so Narada has a mixed reputation for being a troublemaker. But again, he was a divine troublemaker, one who made what ended up being good trouble. So coming back to the text, Sri Ramakrishna tells the captain that you are right, that like Narada and Shukadeva and others, they continue come down a few steps from their natural state of enlightenment. They come down a few steps in order to teach others, in order to speak of God. And that's what Narada does in the legends of India. He travels throughout the universe with his music and his words. There are many, many tales about Narada. So then Narendra begins to sing. Oh, when will dawn for me that day of blessedness, when he who is all good, all beauty, and all truth will light the inmost shrine of my heart? When shall I sink at last, ever beholding him into that ocean of delight? So this is a very beautiful song that Narendra sang. Just mention, it's not pertinent to the context right here, but just mention that later when Narendra's father died and suddenly his mother and brothers and he would go hungry for days. They had no money. Their own family was trying to push them out of the house, this widowed mother and her children, trying to push them out into the street. The family that had been supported by her husband. But when her husband was gone, then they turned against the very family that had supported them. And so then Swamiji, or Narendra, went through a period of great distress. And he went through a period of bitterness towards God, thinking that what is the use of all of this religion? I pray and meditate and everything, and yet this is the result of all of my worship of God. In fact, his mother one day scolded him when he woke up chanting the name of God and said, enough of that. You chant the name of God all day, and yet look at the troubles that we are in. What's the use of it? And so Narendra was stung to the core of his being with the pathos of the situation and the reality of what his mother had said. And so songs like this, after that for a while, he would say, what's the use of such ridiculous songs? That God is all goodness. Where is the goodness when he allows people to starve, innocent people to starve and so forth? But again, this is important in the context, though it's something that comes later, a couple of years later in Narendra's life, but important in the context because of what Sri Ramakrishna had said about even great devotees of God, even those who had attained to great spiritual heights, that sometimes they had to suffer greatly. And Narendra also had to suffer greatly. No sooner had the master heard a few words of the song Narendra was singing than he went into deep samadhi. He sat with folded hands facing the east. His body was erect and his mind completely bereft of worldly consciousness. His breath had almost stopped. With unwinking eyes, he sat motionless as a picture on a canvas. His mind had dived deep into the ocean of God's beauty. And so, yes, when Sri Ramakrishna was in a deep state of samadhi, physical vital signs would leave him if the samadhi was very deep. Even his eyes would stop blinking. His eyes would remain open. If we try to hold our eyes open for a long time, for more than a few seconds, we find the intense burning. We can't do it. We have to blink, and we have to blink several times to moisten our eyes again. But when he was in a high state of consciousness, all the vital signs would leave his body. And so that's what had happened to him. Now, as he was immersed in that ocean of God's beauty that Narendra was singing of, when shall I sink at last, ever beholding him into that ocean of delight, as this song says. Narendra left the room and went to the east veranda, where Hajra was seated on a blanket with a rosary in his hand. They fell to talking. Other devotees arrived. The master came down from samadhi and looked around. He could not find Narendra. The tanpura was lying on the floor. He noticed that the earnest eyes of the devotees were riveted on him. The master, referring to Narendra, he has lighted the fire. Now it doesn't matter whether he stays in the room or goes out. That is, Narendra, by his singing. And it was said by those who knew both Sri Ramakrishna and Narendra that Narendra had the most exquisite, the most beautiful voice anyone had ever heard, except for Sri Ramakrishna's. And people who had heard great classical singers, great bhajan singers and so forth, the people who had heard the greatest musicians of the time said that the Sri Ramakrishna's singing was incomparable, and that Narendra's was incomparable. The only comparison was between Sri Ramakrishna and Narendra, and Sri Ramakrishna's singing was even more beautiful, though it was unimaginable to those who had heard Narendra's singing, even more beautiful than Narendra's. And so he mentions that Narendra went out to speak with Hazara on the veranda. Hazara, those of you who know the life of Sri Ramakrishna know that Hazara was a distant relative of Sri Ramakrishna's, and he had some virtues, but he also was a great hypocrite. And so his sitting there with a rosary was not because he was immersed in God consciousness or something. He would sit there with a rosary in order to impress others, so that people would see him sitting there with a rosary. And but Narendra had great love for Hazara. Narendra and Hazara were great friends, and Hazara had great love for Narendra too, probably because most people looked on Hazara as a great hypocrite, but Narendra was the one person who showed him great friendliness and affection. And so naturally, Hazara would gravitate towards Narendra. Sri Ramakrishna said to Captain and the other devotees, attribute to yourselves the bliss of God consciousness, then you too will experience ineffable joy. The bliss of God consciousness always exists in you. It is only hidden by the veiling and projecting power of Maya. The less you are attached to the world, the more you love God. Now that's a very full paragraph, a very deep and full paragraph. First, he says, attribute to yourselves the bliss of God consciousness, then you too will experience ineffable joy. Attribute to yourselves the bliss of God consciousness means learn to enjoy the thought of God. In the beginning of our spiritual life, and as I often say, unless we are fortunate enough to come into the company of Sri Ramakrishna or a person like him once in 500 or 1,000 years, most of us have to do without that living company. The beginning of spiritual life is itself quite a long time. So in the beginning of spiritual life, we begin with a desire to desire God. We desire to have devotion. So we have a little bit. That's why we want to have more, but it's just a little bit, maybe just a spark. But real devotion is like a blazing fire, and so that's what we want. And so if the more we think about God, the more we try to go towards God, gradually we begin to find that that spark of devotion, it's like going close to God, thinking about God is like fanning a spark with kindling surrounding it. It gradually catches the kindling, and the kindling begins to burn, and then you can begin to burn big logs. And so by fanning the fire of devotion through whatever practice we can do, gradually the fire of devotion begins to burn. And so we attribute divine consciousness to us in the bliss of God consciousness in that way. And then he says, you will experience ineffable joy. If we can develop that God consciousness, then the joy will be ineffable, that is indescribable, unimaginable. The bliss of God consciousness always exists in you, he says. So all of us have that bliss of divine consciousness already within us. That's our birthright. And yet we don't feel it. And yet it seems so difficult to stimulate. It feels so difficult to generate. But he says it's only hidden by the veiling and projecting power of Maya. So Maya, the cosmic force of illusion, which is the sense he's speaking of here. Maya, of course, can be spoken of in different senses. Maya as the Divine Mother, the creative power out of which this universe has come. And there's Vidya Maya, the Maya of wisdom, and there's Avidya Maya, the Maya of delusion. So here he's talking about the Maya which blinds us from the sight of God. And so he says that there are two powers, the veiling power and the projecting power of Maya. And so that is traditional Vedanta philosophy that Sri Ramakrishna is referring to. But it's not just philosophy, it's the actual experience, that there are these two powers to Maya. So the example is given that if you are looking at something in the twilight, there's not enough light for you to see it. At a distance, you see some shape, but you can't make out what it is. And maybe if you're superstitious, you think, oh my God, maybe that's a ghost. I've heard that there's a ghost that haunts these parts. It must be a ghost. And so you begin to see it as a ghost. Somebody else is waiting for their lover, and they think, oh, that's my lover who has come. She's here. She's waiting for me for our tryst. And somebody else sees something else. The twilight, the lack of full light, which hides what it is that you're seeing. Maybe it's only a stump of a tree that people are seeing in these different ways. If there were sufficient light and your eyes were good, you could see it's a stump of a tree. But to mistake it for something else, it has to be veiled. And so the veiling power is that which hides the nature of the divine reality. Once that nature of divine reality is hidden, then the projecting power of ignorance can take over. Then we begin to project on the divine being different visions of what it is. And so we see it as a world, a material world, with the pairs of opposites, with pain and pleasure and so forth. That's from the projecting power of ignorance. It's only if first the reality is hidden from us that we are able to mistake it for something else, as in the example of the snake in the rope. If you can see this rope clearly and see that it's a rope, then you're not going to see a snake. It's because something, either you're not looking at it clearly, or it's dark, or it's hidden in the leaves, or something partially hidden in the leaves, that we can imagine it to be a snake. If we see it clearly, we know it's a rope. And so there has to be the veiling and then the projecting. So what he's saying is that this God consciousness always exists in you. It's only hidden by this veiling and projecting power of Maya. That's what keeps us from seeing it. And it's just as if it were a thin veil. To us, it looks so solid. We can't imagine that all of this, which is so real to us, that all of this could one day just disappear and we could see that everything is divine, that only God exists, nothing but God exists. Yes, it's only a thin veil that hides the reality from us. He says, the less you are attached to the world, the more you love God. Why? Because again, as he says earlier in the paragraph, that the bliss of God consciousness always exists in you. It's always within us. And so if we lose our attachment to the world, then our attachment to God grows, devotion to God grows. So the less you are attached to the world, the more you love God. So that's the dynamic between the process of detachment and renunciation. Then the captain says, the farther you proceed toward your home in Calcutta, the further you leave Benares behind. Again, the farther you proceed toward Benares, the farther behind you leave your home. So that's similar to what Sri Ramakrishna used to say. He said, if you want to get away from the East, simply go to the West. You don't have to think about, I've got to get away from the East, get away from the East, get away from the East. How do I get out? I get away from the East. Well, all you have to do is go towards the West, and the East leaves you. And so that's the same analogy Captain is using, that if you want to get away from Calcutta, go towards Benares, and the further you move towards Benares, the further away you are from Calcutta. So, Master, as Radha advanced towards Krishna, she could smell more and more of the sweet fragrance of his body. The nearer you approach to God, the more you feel his love. As the river approaches the ocean, it increasingly feels the flow of the tides. So again, the more you go towards God, the more you begin to feel the effects of that approaching towards God. The Jnani experiences God consciousness within himself. It is like the upper Ganges flowing in only one direction. To him, the whole universe is illusory, like a dream. He is always established in the reality of the self. But with the lover of God, the case is different. His feeling does not flow in only one direction. He feels both the ebb tide and the flood tide of divine emotion. He laughs and weeps and dances and sings in the ecstasy of God. The lover of God likes to sport with him. In the ocean of God consciousness, he sometimes swims, sometimes goes down, dives down, sometimes rises to the surface like pieces of ice in the water. And so here Sri Ramakrishna is speaking about the difference between the Jnani and the Bhakta. The Jnani experiences God consciousness, that is the knowledge of the self within himself, and wants to remain in that. And so he says it's like the water in the upper Ganges, that is the north of Calcutta, from the Himalayas coming down towards Calcutta, the 1,000 miles or more as it comes down through the plains of India. The water of the Ganges is flowing in one direction, it's flowing towards the ocean. But in Calcutta, when you get there, the water flows in two directions, depending on the tides of the ocean. At high tide, the water, and you see this in places like Bellarmat and Dakshineshwar, where Sri Ramakrishna lived. At high tide in the ocean, you find the water of the river is flowing upstream. The current is flowing upstream. And then as the ocean goes to low tide, then again, the water continues its flow towards the ocean, as it has been doing from the Himalayas. And so you have the ebb tide of the river and the flow tide of the river, the two directions, depending on the time. And so the devotee likes to experience all of the emotions in relationship to God. The Jnani wants to sit still and remain immersed in the silence and the stillness of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. The devotee wants to dance and sing and enjoy the divine bliss of communion with God. And so, as he says, he sometimes swims, sometimes dives down, sometimes rises to the surface like a piece of ice in water. So the difference between the Jnani and the Bhakta is that. The Jnani wants to get out of all manifestation and even the idea of the personal God and just remain in stillness. So that's what you see in a great Jnani like Ramana Maharshi. That was his nature. You see the difference between Ramana Maharshi and Sri Ramakrishna, aside from the fact that Sri Ramakrishna is considered an avatara, forget about that for the moment, but just as an expression of spirituality. With Ramana Maharshi, who was always still, always silent, like the still ocean where all the waves have become stilled and they never rise again. And Sri Ramakrishna was one who danced and sang, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping, sometimes acting like a child, sometimes acting like a sage. As Sri Ramakrishna himself said, he didn't like the drone note in Indian music. There's often a drone note played, either the tanpura, of course, plays 4 drone notes over and over again, so sort of the background of the melody. And sometimes a shanai was used in Indian music just to play one note, against which other instruments played, just the drone note. So he says that some people just are like the shanai, they just want to play one note. But I like all of the notes of the scale. And so that is the playing with the manifestation of God. That's very different from our existence, our life. We are suffering from the effects of ignorance and suffering from the pains and sufferings that come because of our ignorance and our identification with the world. But for one like Sri Ramakrishna, who is free, completely free, he danced and sang in freedom. He wept in freedom. It was because he was completely free. that in the ocean of his being, any wave that would arise out of the freedom of his own being. And each wave would contain the power of the whole ocean behind it. And so his ecstasies, his various states of mind were all full-bodied and free, not like us who are wafted by the waves of the world. He was the ocean itself who could raise any wave of any emotion that was appropriate to the time. So again, the difference between the jnani, like Ramana Maharshi, and Sri Ramakrishna, or a bhakta. Sri Ramakrishna was a jnani and a bhakta. He knew the stillness of the ocean and experienced it on a daily basis, but he could also come back to the dynamic ocean with its waves. So I'll stop here for today, and we will continue at this point next time. So let me give announcements, and if there are any questions, I'll be glad to take those. So on Sunday, we'll have the usual Sunday service at 11 o'clock, and I will speak on the non-dualism of Sri Ramakrishna. And next week on Tuesday, we will have the Upanishad class. We'll continue with the Kena Upanishad, which we just began. I think we did maybe 3 verses of the Kena Upanishad. And we'll continue with the Kena Upanishad on Tuesday at 7:30. And on Thursday, we will return to this class once again at 11 o'clock, Houston time. So now Jitanji is giving me questions. So, do awakened ones who choose not to return to this world not take a form, or do they take on a form and not identify with that form, as do the unawakened who live in the world? Yes, yes. So those who have attained to enlightenment, who want to remain in that state and don't want to come back, then once the body of this life in which they attained enlightenment, once this body dies, once it drops, as they say in India, which at first is a rather strange expression to us, but it's a good expression once you understand it, dropping the body. Once the body drops, then they remain in that enlightened state. They remain as God. But those who have an intense desire to play with God, that is to enter into, to retain an enlightened sense of individuality and play with God, if that desire is strong enough, then even after enlightenment, that desire will sustain an enlightened sense of personality. So that depends on what our strongest desire is. But we shouldn't think that what I want right now, that's going to be what I want at that time. As I've said on occasion in other contexts, when we get so close to God that we, as it were, see God before us, and we see the ocean of beauty, the ocean of love, the ocean of peace, the ocean of fulfillment, the ocean of wisdom and knowledge, then the attraction is so great that we just want to dive in and become that. Again, we don't lose ourselves. As Jesus says in the Christian Bible, that you can't find yourself unless you lose yourself. And so that is really finding ourselves in God by losing what we thought was who we are. And so for many, that attraction, no matter what they thought before, but that attraction is so great that you think, no, I just want to jump in and become that. And you do, and that's what you want, and that's where you remain as all wisdom, all love, all reality. But others who had maintained a strong desire to play with God, when they come that close, then they want to, again, because of their nature, they maintain an enlightened sense of personality and dance and play in manifestation, perhaps life after lifetime, playing with God. And again, others who had a strong desire, like in the Buddhist tradition, they take a vow of the Bodhisattva, that I will not enter into final realization until all beings have attained to enlightenment. And so a person who has a strong inclination towards service because of because of love, not because of a sense of responsibility, not because of a heavy sense of duty or something like that, but because of that ecstatic love for all beings, then they may come back as the examples I gave in the class of sages who retain a sense of enlightened personality in order to help others. And that is their joy. And so we shouldn't think that the end of enlightenment is the same for all beings. The reality is the same. The infinite is the infinite. Brahman is Brahman. The God in God's deepest nature is the deepest nature of God. That doesn't change. But it doesn't mean that our attainment of that state, that enlightened state, expresses itself the same. It may express itself differently. So Thakur regarded Swami Yogananda as one of the ever-perfect souls, but still scolded him for not protesting against people in the boat when they ridiculed Thakur. How is a perfect soul scoldable? Well, a perfect soul is scoldable by Thakur, not by me and you. Or we may scold them, but that would be our ignorance. But it's because, just as Sri Ramakrishna had to learn many things and had many teachers who taught him different things in order for him to become fully conscious of who he was and what his mission was and what his power was. So those who came with him who were Nitya Siddha, ever perfect, like Vivekananda, Yogananda, Brahmananda, Premananda, there were 6 of them who were ever perfect who came with him. They had to be trained also. And they had to be, Sri Ramakrishna also scolded Swami Niranjanananda for the opposite, for reacting too strongly to people who were criticizing Sri Ramakrishna. He said, what does it matter if they criticize me? It doesn't matter. Why do you bother? So he gave the opposite advice to 2 disciples because they went too far in their reactions one way or the other. And so, yes, that's part of awakening them. As Sri Ramakrishna said, when Brahman enters into the 5 elements, Brahman weeps. And so when even a perfected soul enters into human birth, they still have to go through the process of growing up. They still have to go through the process of education. They still have to go through the process of socialization. But there is an innate wisdom and an innate orientation towards God from their very birth, and a sense that they weren't born for ordinary things. Nag Mahashoy, who was not considered one of the Nitya Siddhas, but he was one of the greatest devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, comparable to the other great disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, very, very great. Holy Mother used to say that there are many devotees, but there's only been one Nag Mahashoy. He, from the time he was a little child, he would sit in the lap of his, I forget whether it was aunt or whose lap he would sit in, and look at night and look up into the heavens at the stars and think that he wasn't, that this is not where he belonged. This world is not where he belonged. So that is typical of such souls. They know that they have come for some higher purpose, and they're never entangled by the world. Even then, there are things that they have to learn. So then, is it better to live only with the necessary and simple things in order not to get caught in the maya of temporal things? Yes, if we can. So again, not that everyone has to practice extreme simplicity and austerity, but if we can, that's a very good thing if we can live with simplicity, because the more complexities we have in our life, the more our mind will be tied down by the complexities. To the extent that we can simplify our lives, to that extent we will be able to experience peace. So I always remember the example of Bhavatarini, the wife of Upendranath Upadhyay. Bhavatarini was the one person I had the great privilege of meeting who had known Sri Ramakrishna and actually known him, actually served him as a girl. And Sri Ramakrishna had arranged her marriage to Upendranath Upadhyay. So she knew Sri Ramakrishna. She used to stay with Holy Mother in Dakshineshwar sometimes as a young girl. She knew Swami Vivekananda, all of the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, and I had the great blessing of meeting her and talking to her. I didn't dare talk to her because I was just a kid. But I met her in 1971 in Benares. And her husband had been extremely poor as a boy. And Sri Ramakrishna told him that you go out and you have a desire for wealth. Go out and make money, then you will come to me. And so he went out and he became very, very wealthy. And so she had a large and a luxurious home and everything in Calcutta. The disciples of Sri Ramakrishna used to go after Ramakrishna's passing away and stay in their house. Both of them were very devoted to the monks of the order. But then her husband died, and her only son, her only child, died also. So then she went to Benares, and I saw her when she was 102 years old, living in Benares. She'd given up everything in Calcutta, her wealth, her home, everything, and lived a simple life in a single room with no furniture in it. That was her home, was one room in Benares with no furniture. In one corner was a little pile of her belongings, just a few pieces of, a change of cloth, her change of clothes, and a little box with whatever she had. And that was all that she had. No furniture, no chest or even. Just in one corner of the room against the wall, just a little pile of her minimal belongings. And an asana, a seat in the middle of the room. And she would spend the whole day sitting there doing japa. So for many, many years after her husband died, or decades after her husband died, that was her life. Sitting in this simple room, no belongings, just doing japa. And by the time I met her, she would only eat milk and fruit. That's all that she would take, once or twice a day. I forget which, but I know at least once a day, of course. And the next year, some other monk brahmacharis, novices from America, from the same ashram as myself, they went to India also after I had returned. And they met her the next year, soon before she died. And they went to see her. And when they got to her room, someone told them that no, she's busy now, preparing for Shivaratri, because it was the day of Shivaratri, when that night Shiva would be worshipped all night. So when they heard that she was preparing for Shivaratri, they thought, oh, she must be polishing the vessels and making sandal paste and picking flowers and things. Of course, by then she was 103. So the Swami explained, no, she's not doing that. Preparing for Shivaratri means she's doing even more japa than the japa she does all day, every day. So that was her preparation. So yes, that's a wonderful ideal. And we can't all live like that, unfortunately, but it's a great ideal to have seen somebody like that who lives such an utterly simple life. So, since God is everywhere, what does going near to God mean? That means going near to God in consciousness. That means bringing our mind near to God. God is within us. God is us. God is everything. But our minds are so far from God. So going near to God means pulling my mind into the presence of God. And when I pray to God, feeling that right here, God is right here. And I'm speaking to you, the beloved, who are right here with me. But I'm going near to you means I'm recognizing the fact that you are here. Because normally we feel that God is far, far away. We hardly even think of God. So going near to God means bringing ourselves into the consciousness of God. So I think that's the end of the questions. All very good questions. I appreciate all of that and all of the greetings from people also. So with that, let me give the closing prayer. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha. We bow in adoration to Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, eternal, infinite, the worshipful Supreme Lord, who took on human form out of compassion for all. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all.